Hello,
Hey,
welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm with the Center for American Progress and a columnist for the American Prospect. And with me is my co-host, friend, and colleague, Rob Farley. How are you, Rob?
I'm doing fabulous. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. It's a beautiful Saturday. My daughter is out front having a tea party. I've got two pork butts smoking on the grill. So yeah, everything is good where I am.
Everything is pretty solid where I am. Well, I can't really say it's a beautiful day in Lexington today. It's about 60 and
Yeah.
sort of has rain clouds, but otherwise things are quite solid here. So, you know where things aren't great?
Yes,
Syria, and
I know.
that's my understanding of what we're going to be talking about today. So,
Right.
uh, I guess I wanted to start by going back to, and if I get a chance to do this, and I don't know if I'll have a chance, but I want to go back at some point and take a look at the letter that the Obama administration sent. And I'm not sure exactly who sort of was the signatory on it, but the letter that the Obama administration sent to to John McCain with regards to the use of Syrian chemical weapons. And I want to grade that as if it were an undergraduate paper. Like circling
Yeah,
every
yeah. He sent identical
caveat.
letters to Carl Levin and John
Right,
McCain.
right. It's the most caveat filled, um,
Yeah.
the piece of I don't know 800-word writing that I have ever seen. It was remarkable. I mean, it was almost a masterpiece
Yeah.
in terms of being able to say very very little about sort of what exactly was
Right.
going on. Um, so I guess what do we know about what's going on in Syria right now?
Well, no, according to that letter, it's good. I referenced that in my piece in the Prospect this week. Just saying in the language that has become very, very familiar to people who follow kind of intelligence assessments is that,
Hmm.
the U.S. intelligence services have concluded with varying degrees of confidence that Syria, that chemical weapons were used on a small scale in Syria.
Hmm.
But it was interesting. There was a very clear reference I found, and also in the press call later that day with a White House official that I joined,
Hmm.
stressing, given our recent experience, hint hint, not so subtly, Iraq, we can't just count on these sorts of assessments. We need hard evidence. We need much stronger corroboration
Hmm.
to inform decisions that are going to be very consequential and probably involve the U.S. If this is the case, then it could involve some serious U.S. involvement. So we want to be very careful. I think all of this adds up to a very clear message that the Obama administration does not want more significant U.S. involvement. At least the kind of thing that would involve military force.
Right. I mean, one of the phrases that I loved is that this is simply an intelligence, or it was something along the lines of this is an intelligence analysis, but it does not yet rise to a credible and corroborated fact. Right. Which is, the addition of those two, the very careful addition of those two adjectives,
Hmm.
obviously is a reference to, is a veiled reference to the Iraq situation,
Hmm.
while at the same time just, demanding analysis as, well, what sort of facts are not credible, right? Are there incredible facts? Are there uncorroboratable facts? Um,
Right.
but, I mean, so I guess what we know about Syrian chemical weapons use is as follows, or what we think we know, what the picture that is emerging from Israeli reporting and from
British and French.
British and French reporting, and from the not really particularly verifiable reporting of the Free Syrian Army, is that small amounts of sarin gas have been used in local areas or in localized areas, probably by the Syrian government, and we know it's probably by the Syrian government because we suspect that the rebels don't have access. They may have access to some chemical weapons, but we suspect they will not have access to sarin gas. Um,
Right.
and that these have caused deaths of Syrian rebel, at least Syrian rebel forces, potentially Syrian civilians, in local areas. What we don't know yet is who exactly, even if this was the Syrian army backed by the Assad regime, who gave orders on this, right? We don't know if it was a local commander.
Right.
We don't know if it was senior commanders, if it was the regime itself. I mean, my suspicions on this. I suppose for the regime to decide as a regime act rather than as a local commander act, to use these kinds of weapons, it has to judge the military utility of them as something beyond the risk that they will produce either covert or overt foreign intervention in favor of the Free Syrian Army. And so that means if they have decided to use it, that they either see great military utility in using these, or they just believe that the United States, France, and the United Kingdom are exceedingly unlikely to respond in any productive or useful way to the use of
would
these
you say
weapons.
that even if it's true, everything that the allegations this week, and I would say the evidence is mounting. If it's true and it was used in this, would you say that the use of this in such a small scale might be just evidence that the Assad regime was trying to do it, but trying to do it in such a way that doesn't automatically just trigger everything?
Right. I mean,
just testing the red line, I guess, is a simple way to say it.
Right. If this is an intentional use by the regime, then I think that's the sort of the right way to approach it. Then it's a way of probing the red line for seeing exactly how far it can push the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, because the red line set down the red line set down by the United States it's one of those things where if you keep zooming in on it, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier at the boundary.
Right.
And sort of you get into a pink area before you get to the actual red line. And so the regime may be sort of trying to work its way deeper into that pink line just to see just how far it can get. But of course, using the weapons on a very small scale also limits their military utility, right? And so, it's hard. From a political scientist's point of view, and this obviously is sort of a very amoral perspective, it will be very interesting at some point in the future if we find out exactly how the military authority behind the regime was making these kinds of calculations. What exactly they were looking for when they were making these. Do they think that they can get a war-winning edge at some point, and they're just sort of setting the international community up for that?
So the next step, it seems, is going to the United Nations for a Security Council resolution calling on A, B, and C, trying to pressure Russia to stop, to lean on Syria more, either to cooperate with the chemical weapons inspectors, which I can't really see what's in it for Syria at this point, to let those chemical weapons inspectors into the country. They've been sitting there cooling their heels in Cyprus, for about a month now.
Right.
So really, I'm not. I guess we can. It's nice to have another UN Security Council resolution to condemn Syria even more. But as far as a a kind of military response, I don't think it's in the cards, and I'm not sure what it could really accomplish.
Right. Well, I mean, the other thing is that there seems to be, with all of the caveats in the Obama letter, there seems to be ample space for the Russians to reject the idea that chemical weapons have in fact been used, right? To reject the idea that there is clear evidence that chemical weapons have been used. When somebody said, oh, well, so your level of confidence varies. Well, that means you don't know, and so we can't possibly do anything without inspectors. Right. Oh, but they can't get it. Well, what are you going to do? And so, another resolution is great, doesn't really do anything. There are a lot of graduated responses to this that the West can and almost certainly will pursue. The sort of lowest actual military intervention response would be something along the lines of a no-fly zone, which of course means that we bomb the bejesus out of Syria until they can't shoot down our planes anymore, and then we shoot down all their planes. Below that, though, is stepped-up training and stepped-up coordination activities and stepped-up arming for Syrian rebels, right? Whether directly by the United States or the United States facilitating a significant expansion of material support to the Syrian rebels. And that's certainly something you can do in response to the Syrian army pushing into the pink on this red line here, because is that you can sort of expand the pink back onto them. Even this is a very ambiguous situation. There are ambiguous ways to respond. There are graduated ways to respond, and I suspect we're going to see the administration undertaking some of those.
Right. I think, there are things that can be done, I think, more to help support the countries that are being affected by this. Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, I think chief among them. Jordan is under serious pressure right now. Over 500,000 refugees. It was already dealing with, protests and issues arising, from, their own Muslim Brotherhood affiliates, people dissatisfied with the leadership. But beyond that, we're doing special forces are in Jordan training elements of the the Syrian opposition. Right. But in terms of actually, getting into Syria, the two choices on offer appear to me to be A, it's a murderous shit show, and B, it's a murderous shit show that we own.
Right.
Does that sound reasonable?
That sounds, that sounds reasonable. I think that we will get we will get more conversations that go back to the relationship between this and the Libya war, right? Yeah. Where you can certainly make an argument that after the initial intervention, it became a murderous shit show that we owned, right? That we and the British and the French owned. But at the same time, the sort of ownership we had of that conflict was different in character and different in sort of material nature than the shitstorms we owned in Iraq and the shitstorm we currently own in Afghanistan.
Right. Go ahead.
Oh, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. You can argue that there have been, there's certainly follow-on effects after our engagement in Libya. The attacks on the consulate certainly stepped up, smuggling and terrorist activity in the Sinai is also a troubling one. But looking at Syria, you just simply didn't have in Libya the sort of, proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Libya that you have in Syria. Right. It's kind of it's a crux of a whole range of fault. It's a fault line in various ways. Sunni Shia. The whole. Iran, Iran enjoys its partnership with Syria for, among other reasons, it gives it entree into the Arab world. This is something you saw in Iraq as well. You had various sides arming their own proxies and kind of playing in the politics of it. But you just didn't have that in Libya, and that's why I'm saying. Once the U.S. starts to get involved in that, it's like the definition of foreign policy quicksand.
Right. Although, you could make the argument that we're in foreign policy quicksand no matter what, right? That given that the United States has such significant interest in the area, we have allies all around it, right? That there is no way of not being in quicksand, right? We're sort of standing in quicksand right now. Maybe we're standing just on the edge, but we can't go back, and there's no way to go forward. With the only redeeming characteristic that American bombs are not being dropped and American people or American soldiers and Marines are not dying at this point.
Right.
And that those are good things, right? Those are good things, but they don't mean we're in a good situation.
Sure.
But the other thing about it, and I asked my students this because we just recently had a comprehensive exam here, and I asked them all questions about Syria, and to what extent has this civil war produced either A, broader destabilization in the Middle East, or impacted significantly U.S. interests in the area? I think that when this war started, there were a lot of predictions about both of those that have just really never come to pass, right? Yes, the Syria's neighbors are under significant strain because of this. But the war has sort of gone on continuously and not had broader, more destructive effects on the region, right? It's just a Syrian civil war. I mean, maybe I'm reading it wrongly, and maybe there's an entire sort of underlying layer that I'm missing. But it seems like it's a war that is happening and is not deeply impacting U.S. interests in the region.
I would say it's not having in a super overt way, but I would say that a couple of, the strain on Jordan is a huge issue.
Right.
Not only for the U.S., but for Israel, too. And so, I mean, for the U.S. via Israel. I mean, Jordan is Israel's, sole remaining partner in the Arab, the only country remaining that, will actually openly deal with Israel. I mean, they used to have that with Egypt, even though the new Muslim Brotherhood government, Egypt is not super hot to violate the Camp David Accord and reinvade Israel. It's just an extremely cold peace, even colder than it was under Mubarak, who at least would confess to talking to actual Israelis. So yeah, I mean, there's that. I mean, there's also just the chaos in Syria is one more item on the list of why Benjamin Netanyahu just can't pay attention to the Palestinian issue right now, which also has consequences for U.S. policy the longer that conflict goes unresolved. So yeah, I would say it's not been like this huge disaster for U.S. interests. I would agree there, but I think there are these sort of grinding issues that slowly undermine some of the pillars of the regional status quo. Now, I mean, I guess you can say that that's good, given I think that the status quo for a long time, and I think this is generally understood in the wake of the Arab awakening, is that status quo was dependent upon the U.S. backing various authoritarian regimes and continuing to in the case of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
But that's I mean, it's continuing to be undermined. So the question is, what comes next, and what's the U.S.'s actual ability to shape what comes next?
Right. I mean, it's interesting looking forward to either outcome. And at some point, we have to take seriously the possibility that Assad might win this war. I mean, that's sort of, been something that's been almost absurd for, it seems like, a year, right, as we get more reports of, are these rolling fictions? Is this finally the end, and so forth? And, I'm certain that Assad will fall the day after I say something like, I don't think Assad's going to fall. So I'm not going to say that today. But
can you post that, please?
No.
Today?
Well, I mean, I guess if that would work, then I would be happy to post that. But
okay, well, you'll look kind of stupid, but on the other hand, I'll buy you a steak. So.
Well, and hey, an Assad will be gone, and it'd save a lot of lives, right? I mean, I'm
Assad will be gone plus a steak.
Plus a steak, huh?
So just think about that for a minute.
Can I get a Manhattan with that steak?
All right. Plus, multiple.
Right, but we have. I think that there has been this underlying assumption on both the popular and the policymaking side of this that eventually Assad is going to fall, right? That the rebellion is too serious to imagine an Assad victory. So eventually you are going to get a collapse of the regime in some fashion. And we have to think, what is the policy response going to be if if the regime starts scoring significant victories supported by chemical weapons or not, and starts really pushing back? It's going to have something like that will have very interesting effects in the United States government, right? In the United States political debate, right? Because then it will surely be, Obama, how did you let? We had Assad on the ropes. All we had to do was tip him over, and we failed to do so. And now he hates us more than ever, right? And he's more in control than ever. Which is wrong, right? Because Syria is shattered, right? Syria is broken no matter who, right? It is broken as a power in this region in the same way that Iraq is broken as a power in this region. And so the Syria that emerges from this a year from now is going to be a much weaker regional player than the Syria that was there 3 years ago, at least in military terms, but I think also in economic terms and social terms. But still, right? I mean, the domestic consequences in the United States are going to be very weird if Assad wins, and the consequences in the Middle East are also going to be just fascinating, where Assad really pulled this out.
Right. No, I think that the point about Yes, the domestic criticism of Obama. I mean, just, all you have to do is look at the criticism about June 2009 in Iran.
Right.
I mean, there's this amazing fairy tale that has just grown up. If only President Obama had said different things, or done, TK to come non-specific, done something.
Right.
These demonstrators could have overthrown the Islamic Republic.
Right.
It's absurd, but for a small faction,
Well,
right?
and
I mean,
it's
just
well, not only is it absurd, it's a beautiful line of attack, right? Because
yeah.
if he had been more aggressive rhetorically, then the rebellion would have succeeded. Well, if he had done more than just aggressive rhetoric, but had supplied them with something, then the rebellion. Oh, if he had done more than simply supply them with a few weapons, but launched a few cruise missiles. Oh, if he had, right? It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter.
I've actually
right?
talked to a close advisor of one of the American conservative leaders who's made this attack on Obama, and said, could just explain to me the scenario in which this comes to pass. And of course he couldn't, because it's... So, but staying on Iran for a second, I mean, one of the angles here, and one of the things that sort of raises the political pressure on Obama, having established chemical weapons use as a red line with Syria, is what his actions here mean with regard to Iran and its nuclear program. He's said that an Iranian nuclear weapon is unacceptable. The United States will prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. So a number of conservatives have, said, okay, this is kind of a test case. The Israelis will be watching very closely, and will affect their. I mean, they already, a number of Israelis have stated that they have a problem. They're not quite sure how much to believe Obama when he says this about Iran. So, what's your take on that? How do you think this impacts that?
I think it's going to be. I think it's another very interesting. I mean, it's sort of a classic interdependence of commitments problem. Even if the United States regards the red line with regards to regards the Iranian red line as much more important than the Syrian red line, and in fact, even to the extent that we could say the United States would prefer to hold to the Iranian, would even give up the Syrian red line in order to hold to the Iranian red line. Which is certainly a plausible interpretation. There is the threat that the Iranians will interpret a non-response to Syrian chemical weapons use as no serious red line. But that too is complicated, right? Because we have to sort of be arriving at the assumption first that the Obama United States red line is something that the Iranians take seriously to begin with, right? That they are, deeply concerned about a U.S. attack, and that they are changing their behavior, and because of the threat of this red line, and that some ambiguity about it, the development of ambiguity around it, is sufficient to cause them to change their behavior again, right? And that's something that's really hard to establish. That ambiguity over this creates doubt among them, such that they would proceed in a particular direction and respond in a particular way. So, from my point of view, it's very very interesting, right? I mean, from my point of view, I can almost see more justification in response to Syrian chemical weapons use, and I think we would have to see a little bit more than what we've seen so far, than I can in terms of a military response to. We've talked about this before, and I've written about this before, that I don't think that Iranian nuclear weapon is the end of the world, and I don't think it's worth going to war to prevent. I almost think it's more worth going to a form of war with Syria over the breaking of the chemical weapons taboo. And that almost bothers me a little bit more than the Iranian nuclear weapon in the end. But it's not clear to me that anybody in the administration shares my view about that. So.
Yeah, because this is a conversation I was having with another friend who, was saying so they used. I mean, he was more interested in just keeping the U.S. out of another military intervention in the Middle East. A view I'm totally sympathetic to, but he was just questioning. So what's so bad? I mean, compare, the difference between killing masses of people with chemical weapons versus killing them with artillery. Right. And, of course, that makes little difference to the people who are killed. But it's worth noting that we've been pretty good over the past century at sort of taking chemical weapons off the table for things that are acceptable to use.
Right.
It's been a very successful example of international cooperation, multilateral organizations,
Right.
people signing treaties. These are some things that as progressives, as a progressive, I support.
Right.
It would be great if we could find ways to take more and more weapons off the table, but that's not happening. But we have done a pretty good job of making use of chemical weapons taboo. So I think it's just a it does make it somewhat, it just changes the calculation. Okay, what we're doing. Okay, what are the costs and benefits?
Right.
I would say that the loss of the taboo against use of chemical weapons is a serious cost.
Right.
You know?
Right, and we should say, sort of on behalf of the realist, but even on behalf of the taboo itself, is that singular breaches of the taboo do not render it moot. Right. I mean, there are a whole bunch of ways to respond. The breaches that Iraq and Iran made during the Iran-Iraq War, but particularly Iraq, did not end the taboo. Right. In some sense, they even led to a regime that reinforced it.
Right.
But nevertheless, just like you, I ascribe some value to the maintenance of the taboo.
Right.
And I think it's important to say that, when chemical weapons were used extensively first in World War I, the expectation of everyone was going to be that they would be extensively used in every conflict after that. And one of the great things about 20th century brutal, horrible conflict is that we somehow managed to avoid that outcome by and large.
Yeah.
And so there's value in some form of response to extensive Syrian use of these weapons.
Yeah, I mean, just before we move on, I do want to mention, you mentioned the Iran-Iraq War. Mm-hmm. One of Iran's real complaints over the years, one of the key sort of talking points of its diplomats, both, for foreign audiences and certainly for domestic audiences who suffered under it, was Iraq's use of chemical weapons. And the international community's failure to stop that and essentially turning a blind eye to that. Now, I'll be really, really interested to see the Iranian response to these allegations, if more and more evidence starts to come out, if it's Iran who's now like, what, chemical weapons? What? Mm-hmm. We don't know anything about any chemical weapons, which is precisely what the response from the international community that they've been making such a huge deal out of for the past 30 years.
Right. That is interesting.
So let's move on. I think it was Thursday where we saw the opening of the George W. Bush Museum for Outstanding Achievement in the Field of Excellence.
Right.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, something like we saw a lot of presidents out there.
A lot of presidents. I think all the living presidents there. Mm-hmm. An enormous amount of coverage, a surprising amount of coverage. Mm-hmm. Hats off to that PR team. But I think that goes to what we also saw this week was a massive rollout of the Rehabilitate George W. Bush movement.
Right.
Across various fronts. And I think, Chris Hayes had a great segment on his show, I think it was Thursday night, where, he talked about, the various angles that they're taking. There's like he's such a nice guy angle. And then there's he was a decider angle, which is this is Bush's, this has always been kind of his big thing. I'm the decider, I make decisions, whether they're good or bad decisions, it's secondary. The fact is I make decisions.
Right.
And then there's the third track, which is just ignore his huge blunders.
Right.
And focus.
There were no terrorist attacks on the United States during George, except for that one. Right. And there were no recessions except for the one that was at the beginning or the one that was at the end. Right. So,
no, 7.5 years of economic growth. Right, yeah, okay. Exactly. No, he just, it's like a series of mulligans he takes. He takes a mulligan after 9/11. He takes a mulligan after the occupation of Iraq. The clock on Iraq begins with the surge. It's a rather remarkable kind of series of suspension of disbelief for a lot of this. But did you watch any of the ceremony? I have to confess, I really didn't. I saw a few of the clips, and I did note how well dressed George H.W. Bush was compared to the other presidents.
I mean, he did
those pink socks.
Oh, those pink socks were fabulous.
They were awesome.
Yeah, I followed a little bit of it. I mean, some of what generated some of the buzz on the right was some polling data that suggested that GWB had reached 45% or something along those lines in terms of approval, which was considerably higher than what he left office with, although considerably
Right.
lower than every other president on the list. So,
Right.
so I didn't follow it a lot. Oh, we should remember there's another line too, and this is the Keith Hennessy line, which is, no, he really is the smartest guy in the room, right? And this is just sort of I mean, Jonathan Bernstein had an interesting response to that one. It's like, being the smartest person in the room is different than being intellectually engaged.
Yeah.
And there is considerable evidence from the Bush White House, from partisans in the Bush White House, from the way that the Bush White House was discussed by its supporters at the time, that however smart George W. Bush may be, and you can't be president without being stupid, or it's very hard for stupid people to become president, right? It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. That he was
I don't know,
intellectually
man.
incurious.
Well, I take your point, but I think I'll just say Sarah Palin here, who was
Right. Well, but Sarah Palin may be not even the exception that proves the rule, right? She may be proving the rule, right? Sort of, if you take a look at her rollout and see how badly she did right there, and she did during the entire rollout and during the entire 4-year period after, I mean, you could make an argument that George W. Bush would never have made those errors. He really had better handlers and so forth. And he was sort of born to aristocracy, and so he knew not to make those mistakes. But I mean, you could make the argument that in fact she fully demonstrates the rule that you can't be that you have to be really, really bright in order to succeed in politics.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, if not for A, B, and C, if not for the economic crisis,
Right.
all I'm saying is, like, once you get on a major national presidential ticket, your chances of becoming of winning are fairly good.
Right.
All things considered. And say they did win. I mean, she's one 80-year-old's heartbeat away from becoming
Right.
president. So I mean, I take your point, but I mean, I think she's an interesting just a data point here.
Right. I mean, I would say that even if that happens, she'd be the exception that proves the rule. But in fact, she's not even the exception that proves the rule. She just proves the rule.
Okay, I got it.
But anyway, yeah, no, it's a really interesting effort. Led by Jennifer Rubin, or not led by, but Jennifer Rubin is an important player, important cog in the machine in terms of rehabilitation of the Bush White House.
Right.
I mean, I always believe, because Bush has a fairly pleasant public persona, right? It was always obvious to me, at least, that there was going to be that his popularity would move up after he left the White House, after he stopped doing horrible things to the country and the world. We should hasten to add. And I mean, it seems like more than just intra-Republican politics, too, right? I mean, there's sort of a broader effort here to counterpose Bush and Obama, which, I think only works to Obama's advantage. But yeah, it's a really interesting PR effort.
No, and I think we're going to be living with it for the next, years.
Right.
Because there is that whole gang whose own sort of reputations are bound up with his, so they're really invested in pretending it wasn't a huge failure.
Right.
So I want to mention one other thing really quickly before we finish, which is the Ron Paul Institute, which had its rollout this week or the week before.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't make too much of it, but what made me sit up and take notice was the fact that Joe Lieberman and John Kyle, two former senators, one a Republican and another a quote-unquote Democrat and then independent, who are now both, showing, well, it tells you what you already knew about Lieberman. They are now working with the American Enterprise Institute on essentially, this American leader. I forget what the actual name is, but it's, your basic neoconservative, America needs to be bold and lead the world. And, they came out with this piece in the Washington Post slamming what they called neo-isolationism.
Right.
Now, that's the sort of thing that tells me that they are taking the Rand Paul, Rand Paul, whatever you want to call it, take on foreign policy pretty seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case. I think that, notwithstanding how incoherent Rand Paul's position on drones is and his filibuster regarding drones, that it was really good for Rand Paul. And it was really good for this sort of counter-hegemonic narrative. And I mean counter-hegemonic in two different ways. This counter-hegemonic narrative in Republican foreign policy. And on the one hand, being against the current hegemony of neoconservatives within the Republican foreign policy cabal, but also that you can broadly label Rand Paul and Ron Paul as counter-hegemonic, as in not believing that the United States ought to play a hegemonic role. And I guess, in the end, the answer is it doesn't have to be coherent, right? Rand Paul does not actually have to know what he thinks about drones from a day-to-day basis, as I think was demonstrated pretty clearly last week. That as he would go,
it's just where the drones are flying is.
But it's not even that, right? He said you could blow up a guy coming out of a 7-Eleven with a drone, right? I mean, it's like, well, shoot him or blow him up, with a drone. What does it matter to me? And it's like, really, Rand? That's what the
hey, that's counter-hegemonic. We're not projecting our power, so
right,
totally consistent.
Exactly, but once you have sort of established that, then things kind of become tribal, no matter what people are saying. And I think that you're seeing those dynamics right now.
Right.
And, I mean, I wonder in sort of the long history of this, if this isn't going to be seen, the rise of the Pauls isn't going to be seen as a response to the ability of the neocons just to seize utter control, like utter iron grip over the DC GOP foreign policy establishment. And cut out all the realists over the course of the last 10 years. Scowcroft is neither Rand Paul nor a neocon, right? He is some sort of pleasant middle ground, but he doesn't exist anymore. And the Pauls are the response to this neocon domination. So it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. All right. No, this is something that we'll be following pretty closely going forward, and holding coats as much as we can for this fight. I would assume. But anyway, great talking to you as always, and have a great rest of the day.
Okay, you too.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right, bye-bye.